Thank you, and thank you all for coming to the Legacy Project. And also thank you to the co-chairs of the Legacy Project for asking me to introduce our guest today, Josh Neufeld. Josh Neufeld is a comics journalist, a story, and an illustrator. He has worked with Harvey Pekar on his groundbreaking alternative comic book series, American Splendor, and more recently, he has illustrated the New York Times bestseller, The Influencing Machine, Brooke Gladstone on the Media. He's author of A Few Perfect Hours and Other Stories from Southeast Asia and Central Europe, which was nominated for the prestigious Will Eisner Award, and he is co-creator of the alternative comic series Titans of Finance and Keyhole. He's here today as part of the Legacy Project to talk about his graphic novel, A.D., New Orleans After the Deluge. A.D. is also a New York Times best-selling graphic novel and was nominated for the Eisner Award as well. Just a few words about comics journalism and the appraisal of comic art as a medium of communication and cultural transmission before we start. Though many of us think of humor, superheroes, and blockbuster films when we hear the word comics, it should also be observed that within the past few decades, comic art has developed into a serious medium for the transmission of culture and history. In 1986, Art Spiegelman published Maus, A Survivor's Tale, My Father Bleeds History, a memoir about his father's Holocaust experience and his own tangential experiences of the subject through a reflexive appraisal of his relationship to his father. 5 years later, he published Maus II, and Here My Troubles Began. The following year, he won a Pulitzer Prize for this innovative and intimate approach to the subject of genocide. And I'd say on page 42 of Josh's book, there's a little nod to Maus if you look closely. 13 years later, in 2004, Spiegelman produced In the Shadow of No Towers, a massive book of 20 by 14-inch plates made of thick cardboard paper stock and rendered in the style of the old newspaper broadsheets that depicted his memories of September 11th. He explains how this aesthetic decision came from his love of comics as a child. Specifically, he says, the only cultural artifact that could get past my defenses to flood my eyes and brain with something other than the images of burning towers were old comic strips, that they were made with such skill and verve, but never intended to last past the day they appeared in the newspaper, gave them a poignancy. They were just right for an end-of-the-world moment. Here, Spiegelman is referencing the historic ephemerality of comic art. However, today we are seeing comic artists in the tradition of Spiegelman who are producing historically important work that documents, narrativizes, and dramatizes crucial moments in regions, nations, and cultures across the world. If you're interested in this genre, you can investigate graphic novels from authors such as Ted Rall, author and artist of To Afghanistan and Back, Joe Sacco, author and artist of Palestine, and Marjan Satrapi, author and artist of Persepolis. I believe that our guest today, Josh Neufeld, epitomizes the spirit of this convergent new genre that blends words and pictures together to record history and capture social reality. His experience as a Red Cross volunteer in Biloxi, Mississippi, in the aftermath of Katrina, have reflexively informed the execution of his work and brought an organic authenticity to the page that will preserve the memory of Katrina and its impact on the region for decades to come. With that, I introduce to you comics journalist Josh Neufeld.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Nice crowd. You probably all have to be here or you're going to fail or something, right? No, I really appreciate it. I want to thank the County College of Morris, John Saltas, Michelle Altieri, Emily Burks, and the Legacy Project Committee. Thank you, Matt, for that introduction. It does mean a lot to me that more than 10 years down the road from Hurricane Katrina, that students like yourself are staying connected to this event. It's weird to me because when I was doing this project originally, which was in 2007, 2008. That was still so soon after the events of the hurricane, and it was very much a feeling of journalism, of sort of reporting, as it was happening, sort of these people who lived through this experience and what they were going through. And I was actually serializing this project online month by month, and it was almost, by the end, it was up to date to where they were at that moment, because a lot of the book really focuses on the aftermath of the hurricane and how a city recovers from a huge traumatic event like this. But now it's 10 years since the hurricane. A lot of students like yourselves were probably too young to even know about it. It didn't affect you up here in the Northeast. And so now this book has become history, which is strange and kind of cool, that it still has resonance. So what I'll talk about today, and hopefully this will be interesting, I was just going to show you a lot of pictures and talk about sort of my journey from sort of witnessing the hurricane to the events that led to the book, and then a little bit about how I go about creating a project like this. So going back to late August 2005, when Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast and New Orleans levees were breached and the city was flooded, I was at home in New York. And like millions of other people around the country and around the world, I watched in horror as events unfolded in New Orleans. The thing that struck me the most was the sight of all those people trapped and stranded on their roofs, in their attics, on freeway overpasses, as well as those who had been basically abandoned for days, almost week at a time, at these shelters of last resort, the Superdome and the New Orleans Convention Center. I struggled to put myself in the place of those people in that region, imagining what it would be like to be trapped in the floodwaters, to wade through chin-high water, to lose everything you owned, to water and to mold. For me, the overwhelming emotion was loss of people, of possessions, of government, of community, of trust in the accepted facts of life. I couldn't get a handle on all those different types of loss. And I'm not going to get into it too much but I think a lot of the reason why I had such a powerful response to it was because I also am a New Yorker, and I had lived through 9/11, which at that point had only been 4 years prior, and the feeling of helplessness of being a New Yorker, of seeing the towers fall down, knowing all those people had died, not being able to do anything. There were no bodies to dig out of the rubble, there was no blood to give. Really left me with a powerful feeling of helplessness. And so when it came to this event, I was actually able to do something, as minor as it was. And so I volunteered with the Red Cross. So first, my wife and I spent some time at the New York headquarters of the Red Cross, working with evacuees and refugees who actually were straggling all the way up from the Gulf Coast, people who literally had been in floodwaters, 3 days before, had waded into dry land, had been evacuated by bus somewhere, and then sent on a bus to New York with just still their wet clothes on their back, maybe a blanket, and were appearing on the streets of New York City, needing shelter, needing housing, needing some money to get by. So we were able to work with those folks, collecting donations and things like that for a while. But soon I wanted to do more, and I pursued training as a disaster response worker. And so 6 weeks after the storm, I was deployed to Biloxi, Mississippi to help with the recovery there. And mostly I spent my 3-week assignment bringing prepared meals to residents of the flood zone, many of whom had lost everything in the hurricane. Now, of course, Biloxi and that region of the Gulf Coast suffered a very different fate than what befell New Orleans. It's always important to just remind people that Hurricane Katrina didn't actually hit New Orleans proper. It missed the city, but the storm surge, all the water that had been churned up and brought in by the storm overwhelmed Lake Pontchartrain and the levees, the surrounding levee system, and so they ended up flooding the city retroactively. The city didn't start really flooding until like a day or two after the storm had actually passed. So there was this period where people in the city, in some of the lower lying areas, thought, "Ooh, we survived." Those who hadn't evacuated, and then the water started coming. That's a big section of the book is about somebody's experience with that. But in Biloxi and some of those regions, the storm directly hit that area, and it was just totally devastating, as you can see. There was a 30-foot high storm surge that just wiped away everything in its path. And it's just profound to be in an area that has been affected that powerfully by nature. So I took pictures during my stay there, and I didn't realize at the time I had no plans to do a comic book about Hurricane Katrina at this point. I really was just there as a citizen, as a fellow human being. But during the time I was there, I met a lot of people on my route. We were there every day. We got to know our clients, as we called them, and they got to know us, and a lot of informational, cultural exchange happened, and I didn't realize it at the time. I didn't know I was about to become a journalist, but I was doing background research at that point, and really sort of immersing myself in the experience of living through a hurricane. And of course, later on, those experiences, that sort of information helped me to really understand the experiences of the characters that I talk about in my book. And I actually also got a chance to visit New Orleans when I was on my deployment. At this point, the city was no longer flooded. They had pumped the water out, but basically huge portions of the city were uninhabited. Everybody who'd been in the flood zones had been evacuated, and there were whole sections of the city which were completely empty, like a ghost town. And you could drive around. We had a Red Cross vehicle, so we basically could drive anywhere we wanted. You could drive the wrong way down one-way streets. You could just pass through intersections because there were no working electricity or stoplights or anything. And some of the things we saw were really just brought again to home what it was like to be in that place during the flooding. So, for instance, this image of this boat that at a certain point, obviously there was water there, and the boat had stopped to maybe see if it could get gas from a gas station, and then they abandoned the boat, and the water went away, and then you were left with a boat at a gas station. This was also a sight we saw all over the place, which were the search marks that had been left by the various National Guard or Army or Coast Guard that had come through while the city was still underwater, checking all the different houses to make sure that there weren't people or animals trapped inside, or to clear out bodies. And again, this remnant, of something that had happened only a few weeks before. And the other weird thing was, even though it had been so recent, everything just felt like it had been there like that for 100 years. It was just this weird veneer on top of everything of the floodwaters. So anyway, as a volunteer, as someone who was going down there and having these experiences, I was blogging about this the whole time. And in my posts, I wrote about my reaction to the hurricane, signing up for the Red Cross, the conditions of the Gulf, working with survivors, visiting New Orleans, much more. And my blog was commented on and read by a lot of people, not only other Red Cross volunteers, readers of mine from my comics days, but also people in the region who'd been affected, other Red Cross people, Biloxi area residents. And eventually, just because I don't know, I felt, again, compelled to I'm a storyteller, so I ended up editing down all my blog posts and including all the comments and stuff from readers, and putting together a little pamphlet, basically, that I printed up myself, and I distributed to anybody who had been in the exchanges that I'd had. And somehow that book, Katrina Came Calling, found its way into the hands of the editor of Smith Magazine, who had just serialized a comic about the Iraq War on his website, Smith, and wanted to do another one, and he wanted to do something about Hurricane Katrina. So it was this commission, basically, that he asked me. I had this background as a nonfiction cartoonist, someone who'd worked with Harvey Pekar and American Splendor, who'd done a book on backpacking and traveling around the world, and had this direct experience with the hurricane. He asked me if I'd be interested in telling the story of Hurricane Katrina from a journalistic point of view on his site, and I immediately said yes. And after right away just agreeing that my own experiences would play no part in this book, that was not important. What we wanted to do was find a cross-section of residents of New Orleans who had gone through a number of different experiences related to the storm and tell their story. And that was a huge weight off my back, because up to that point my comics writing had all been autobiographical, but I really had no interest in detailing my own experiences. They were not relevant to this larger story. So this is a time when everybody says, well, why are you doing this in comic books? I got that question so much. And the implicit, judgment in that is, why would you use this lighthearted, silly art form to tell such a serious story? And of course, I don't see it as a lighthearted, silly art form. And I had so long been working in this form as a serious mode of storytelling and telling real stories that I'd sort of forgotten that there still is a stigma attached to comics. But hopefully that most people now at least understand that comics don't have to just be for kids, and that they really can tell any kind of story. And for me, the comics form is particularly suited to this type of work. It offers the reader a uniquely intimate experience. That was something I think I just intuitively knew, but is something a lot of people have talked about since then, is this feeling that they felt like they were right there in the experience with these characters. That's a great testament to the form of comics. And I'm just glad I didn't get in the way of that with the limitations of my own art form. And also, there are some things that you can convey in comics that you can't express in words, or that you couldn't be there to have witnessed, but you can encapsulate it using the comics storytelling form. And there's something that a lot of us just intuitively understand if we grow up reading comics that's really unique to the form, which is that this combination of pictures and text and the fragmented narrative of the panel-by-panel format engages the reader in a particularly active role of interpretation and inference. So, you, as someone who's read comics before, even if they were kids' comics, you know what to do in the gutter, in the space between the panels. When you're filling in that information, you, as the reader, are actively taking part in this experience of reading a comic. And this image is from Scott McCloud's seminal book, Understanding Comics, which anyone who has any interest in comics at all should definitely read. It's a great book. So in telling this story, I could focus on what I saw were vital issues in the storm's aftermath. Not only the lost lives, the flooding, the personal displacement, the loss of so many material possessions, but also the virtual abandonment of those thousands of people at the shelters of last resort, and the misleading media coverage of the event. Now, that's something that a lot of you probably don't remember, but at the time, there was all this talk about roving gangs of rapists and murderers at these two places, the Convention Center and the Superdome, and how they were shooting at helicopters which were bringing them supplies, and they were raping little girls, and there were dead bodies stacked up in the freezers, and all of this hyperbolic reportage about what was going on at these two places. And of course, none of it was true. Like, literally none of it was true. And it only was corrected some days later and in the weeks to come. But the perception that people had of poor, mostly people of color, all together in one place was that they would go crazy, and start killing each other and everybody else. And so this actually is a panel from the next book I did after A.D. the Influencing Machine. There was no raped child, no 30 bodies in the Convention Center freezer. They were merely rumors repeated by officials. Later, some noted that the stories fit an ugly, if unconscious, racial narrative. And this is the editor of the New Orleans daily paper, the Times-Picayune, who reported some of this stuff. And of course, they had to issue a correction later. But he said, if the Superdome and the Convention Center had harbored large numbers of middle-class white people, it would not have been a fertile ground for this kind of rumor mongering. And unfortunately, studies have shown that when you report something factually incorrect, even if you correct the record later on, that correction itself only reinforces the wrong information from the first time. So it's sort of like once that bad info gets out there, there's kind of no putting it back again. But that's why this book can be good for those of you who didn't have to hear about all that stuff the first time around. You can start with a clean slate. So comics are a very powerful means of bringing real subjects, real experiences straight to the reader's consciousness. And when they're done right, they can make you feel that you were there. And as I talked about before, I also see now that I needed to do AD for myself subconsciously. I hope that by relaying these stories of trauma and heartbreak, I would find a way to process the lingering anxieties that I still harbored after 9/11. This is actually from a comic I did shortly after the attack on the Twin Towers, which is, it takes the lyrics of the famous Frank Sinatra Candor and Ebb song, New York, New York, and it sort of transposes them into the events of that day and takes it from being this very triumphalist sort of song to actually being quite heartbreaking. So my role, now we get into like how this all happened. My first role as the writer-artist of AD was that of a journalist, finding subjects for the story. People always ask me, where did you find these people? Well, I talked to friends and friends of friends from New Orleans. I spoke with people who ran regional nonprofits and other local organizations. I tracked down accounts of the storm and its aftermath on the radio, in magazines, newspapers, and on the internet. I made lots of phone calls and I sent lots of emails. You can see here, as I was working on the book, I went down to the region on 9 separate occasions over a 4-year period to interview the people that I eventually selected many times to photograph their homes and the places where they had been during the storm, and just to get a sense of the whole area. And this is the panel that people always react to, because these are the actual folks. These are the 5, how many people we have here? 6 people that I actually found to talk about their stories. And I wanted to talk about a lot of different things. And I wanted to find a diverse group of people, different backgrounds, different ages, different regions of the city that they lived in, different experiences, from those who lost everything they had to some people who weren't affected at all. And as I said, I found them in different ways, including some of them through their blogs that they were keeping. So as a group of individuals, Denise, Leo, and Michelle, Abbas and Darnell, Kwame, and the doctor, as they took shape, I began to think of this as a people's history of Hurricane Katrina. It was really important to me to get to the humanity of my subjects and not to portray them just as victims. And of course, my job as a storyteller was to take these real people and make them into comic book characters, bringing them to life on the page. I decided to show my characters' lives before the hurricane, how they dealt with the storm as it hit, and during the flooding and the direct aftermath, where they ended up if they evacuated. And by telling their stories, I hope to give readers a sense of the community of New Orleans as a whole, and how that story has continued to change since the catastrophic events of the storm and the flooding. So I gather some of you have read AD and some haven't. So if you've already read it, I'm going to do a little recap. You can, check your phones or something. But for those who haven't, here's a little about each of the characters. This is Kwame. He's a high school student and a preacher's son from New Orleans when the school starts. As the book opens, his family, hearing about the hurricane, they decide to evacuate to Tallahassee, Florida, where one of Kwame's older brother goes to college. And they figure they'll only be gone a couple of days at the most. I hope I'm not spoiling everything by saying that that's not what happens. His house is completely flooded and basically destroyed and had to be gutted and rebuilt from scratch. And he didn't come back to New Orleans for a number of years after leaving for that one weekend. Abbas and his friend Darnell, who stayed behind to watch over Abbas's family-run supermarket located in the uptown area, they survived the flooding okay, and then I was talking about how, they survived the hurricane itself, But then I was talking about how the water just started to appear and rise and rise and rise, and this is what they ended up dealing with. Always thinking that at any moment the pumps are going to start working, that the water's going to recede, and again, it ended up being like 7 or 8 feet high in that area, and they had to spend a couple of nights sleeping on the roof of the tool shed of his apartment. Leo and Michelle, who are 20-something New Orleanians living in the mid-city neighborhood, the day before the hurricane strikes, they finally decide to evacuate to a friend's apartment in Houston. And Leo, again, in Houston, they find out about the flooding. Their neighborhood takes, I think, 5 or 6 feet of water. I mean, all you need is a foot of water to ruin everything. And he has this sort of waking nightmare about losing all his comics and everything else he owns. He owned a lot of comics. The doctor, who's a real-life Southern dandy who lives in the French Quarter. He is a well-known figure in New Orleans, used to be a health commissioner, a frequent guest at the famous Galatoire's restaurant, like where he has his own table, reserved. As he says later, whenever I want to know what's going on in New Orleans, I just go to Galatoire's and talk to the waiters. And so here he is with one of his favorite waiters who's actually telling him about the storm coming. And as the days pass, since he lives in the French Quarter, which was like, the wealthy area that was settled first in New Orleans, it's above seawater, didn't suffer really any damage during the storm, he was able to stay behind and actually did some really great work, working with paramedics coming from out of town, EMTs, and other health practitioners who stayed behind to help treat wounded and to just set up a street clinic in exile, they called it, because FEMA, which is the government organization in charge of emergencies, was notably lacking in their ability to respond to the hurricane. And finally, Denise. She is a social worker who, when the book starts, is living with her mother and some other family members in a small apartment in Central City. And she ended up deciding to stay behind when everybody was told to evacuate because her mother was a surgical tech at a nearby hospital, and they offered to let everybody stay behind and give them shelter. But then when they got to the hospital, there was no more room for her and her family, so she went back to her apartment. But the storm actually hit her apartment pretty hard. I think it actually lifted the roof off of it. And as you can see, it was quite an ordeal for her. She did survive that and ended up reuniting with her family and ended up at the convention center. So her story was particularly important to me. I wanted to have somebody who'd either been at the Superdome or at the convention center to really get the story of what happened there. So she and her family are trapped and stranded there for 3 days in the heat and horror of that post-flooding scenario, where they repeatedly witness scenes like this, where the National Guard came through on armored personnel carriers with their rifles out, pointed at all the people at the center, instead of offering them supplies, medicine, food, water. They just came around making sure nobody got out of there. And there's a famous incident, which we also talk about in the book, where a group of people tried to escape over into Jefferson Parish across the Crescent City Connection Bridge, and were actually prevented by the sheriff of that county at gunpoint from crossing over. Like, this is America, right? Aren't we allowed to go basically where we want in public areas? But no, at that point, the sheriff of that county decided he didn't want any of those New Orleans people escaping flooding coming into his county. And they actually, I think, fired rifles over people's heads and sent them back to the convention center. As Denise very poignantly says, how can this be happening? Don't the authorities know about us? Don't they care? And that was really one of the overwhelming feelings that a lot of people had as they witnessed this, was sort of like, how can our government, a first world country, the United States of America, that sends supplies and equipment and people to all these other countries, these poor third world countries that suffer, and we're the ones that help them out. How can we abandon our own people like this? It really laid bare some of the realities of life in this country for folks who'd been living in an idea that we're all doing great. So again, just to remind you, these people, these characters, are real people who agreed to have their stories told in this unusual graphic novel form and allowed me to intrude into their life into every aspect of their lives and researching the story. And it wasn't always, a fun thing to think back about some of these events for a lot of these folks. So I'm really incredibly grateful to all of them for taking a chance on a project like this. A couple of them had also, never even imagined that you could use this comics form to tell a story like this. But they took their chance with me, and I'm so grateful to them. And they've continued to support the project. Some of them did media appearances with me on the radio or even on TV shows after the book, or came to book signings and signed copies of the book as well. And as you'll see at the very end, I'm still in touch with almost all of them. So let's just talk a little bit about the process of making this book. As I mentioned, I wrote a lot about the experiences on my blog, and having those notes, having that background information was obviously really useful for me as I just started to think about how to tell this story. And there were so many resources out there, photography, video, radio, print, the internet, that form part of my background research, and then also help me when I'm doing an image like that. Obviously, that sort of image was key to me being able to create this image. And as I hope you understand, I know it sounds like I'm just hammering this, but a lot of people read this entire book, read what I talk about, how these are real people, and then at the very end still think that this is somehow a fictional account and these are not real people. So I just have to keep reminding them. Like, if there are word balloons in people's mouths, those are the words that they said. So the events that AD actually happened, most of the dialogue is taken from our conversations, quotes from interviews or entries in their blogs. The places and the details are real as well. I don't know if this was the page you were talking about, but these were actually the books and DVDs and toys and so forth that Leo had on his shelves. And all of those things are important for me to document, because I think we can all relate to, if something like this happened to us, you think about the things that are important in your life, or the book that you read when you were 10 and you'll always keep because it meant so much to you, or some figurine that you bought on a vacation at Disney World, or whatever it is that means something to you, and what it would be like to lose those things. And so I try to be as specific as I can in these kinds of things. And like for a scene like this, obviously I wasn't there while the store was flooded, but Leo, not this character, another separate character, actually lived near Abbas's store, and he went, on my request, took his digital camera, went to Abbas's store, introduced himself. Hey, I'm another one of the characters in this book that Josh is doing. And took pictures of the entire store from every possible angle. Being a comic book fan, he kind of knew what I might need to draw something like this, and took like 50 pictures that he emailed to me that I was able to use to recreate scenes like this. When it came to structuring the story, it was when I had the concept of the prologue, which, if you read the book, sort of shows the entire history of the storm as it built up in the Gulf Coast and then swoops in and hits New Orleans and Mississippi, Louisiana, and all the way through the flooding and the aftermath. So it sort of encompasses the events of the entire book right at the beginning, but from this sort of like God's eye view perspective. And then the book itself starts and we meet these people and we see how these events, these huge global events, in a sense, affected their individual lives. So it was as I conceived of this concept, and here we see some examples of the storm on the Superdome and the flooding of the city, and sort of those events that everybody could relate to. And then we start to see, these actual people as those moments are happening. And getting those details right, really feeling the sense of the emotions of the characters, incorporating feedback from the various subjects so that they felt comfortable with the way that I was portraying them. Like, for instance, Denise was incredibly helpful in helping me just get the details of what happened at the convention center, not only the sort of general details, but like exactly what her experiences were like, encounters with some of the other people there. This is when a guy she met was talking about the scene when they tried to cross over the bridge and were sent back by the sheriffs. And just having her as sort of a fact checker for dialogue and details that I, as a New Yorker, as a non-New Orleanian, wouldn't be able to, and wouldn't even want to try to fake. She was there to help me get those details right. And as a writer, I made some rules. I decided that once the prologue was over and the book began, I would always move forward in time. So if there was one character whose true experiences best fit the moment in the timeline, that was the moment that I needed to portray. Like, I wasn't going to show, two different sets of characters dealing with the flooding if one of their experiences seemed really like archetypal or iconic to me, or losing all of their possessions. I mean, I think as a reader, you understand that these experiences sort of extrapolate out to so many other people. And I can't tell you how many times I've been at signings, especially down in New Orleans and Texas, where people have told me, they've come up and they've signed the book and they said, this character here, Denise, that was my sister. Not meaning that was literally Denise is her sister, but that her sister had the exact same experience. Or this happened to my mom, or my family had to evacuate and they've been in Minneapolis for the last 3 years, whatever it was. So it's amazing how these specific stories have this kind of general truth to them. From there, it was just letting the story spool forward. And as I just was mentioning, these stories, the characters, their stories are so compelling and so dramatic that it really made my job as a writer much easier. I don't have to try to inject some kind of fake excitement or drama into this stuff. In fact, there were some scenes that happened with Denise at the convention center that were so horrible that I actually chose to leave them out, because I thought I would push the reader's sense of believability to a point where they would distance themselves from this experience, because they would feel this is too much. This couldn't have happened. So I'm not going to believe anymore that this is real. So I had to actually moderate some of what I talk about that Denise went through, just so that I felt like there was a proper balance of reality and melodrama. And obviously the most important elements of creating the story were my characters. I call them characters, but they're real people. For instance, with Denise, I wasn't able to visit her by then gutted apartment. And so based on her description, we were sitting together at a Chinese restaurant in Baton Rouge, and I sketched out on a napkin basically the floor plan of her apartment. And then later I did a little more detailed one. And plugging the street address into Google Earth, I was able to see the shape of the building as a whole. Google Maps didn't yet have the street view option at that time, so we're going back, this was before the Google cars went around mapping everything, and you could see. So actually I was sort of bummed, because later on I found out that I basically created an exterior for her apartment. She lived above a boxing gym, which is kind of cool, but after the book was out, I drove by the address where she lived, and I saw it was totally different than what I drew, and I was upset about that, because if I'd had Street View, I would have been able to get it right. But to be able to portray scenes like this one, I needed to do that sort of, reference and get a sense of where the bed was in relation to the floor, and then how did you get into the kitchen, and, really make it feel real. Similarly, with Leo and Michelle, I did a floor plan for Leo's apartment as well. I can get pretty obsessive about stuff like this. But also, all this prep work really helped me, because just by chance, Leo happened to have taken some photos. He had taken some pictures of his home office right before he evacuated for the hurricane. So I could use a picture like that to be able to portray a scene like this, where he's learning about the hurricane and deciding what to do. And then, of course, he took pictures of the actual apartment when he returned. So photographic reference like that was vital to drawing a scene like that, or like this. I always found this really poignant when he talked about what it's like to walk on top of all of these things, which, were so meaningful. Like, it was worse that he could actually still see these smudged, disgusting remnants of all of the books and stuff that he loved so much. It would have been better if it had just been wiped away and he could never see it again. and you have to pack it all up and get rid of it. I mean, everybody's job was to empty out their apartments. So how do I actually draw these things and do it? First, I write a script. I take all the notes, all the material I've got, all my plans for how I want to structure it, and then I actually write a script. It sort of looks like a movie script. It has like panel descriptions and then like what each character is saying, any sound effects, things like that. And of course, I'm visualizing it while I'm doing this, but then I take those scripts and I create little thumbnails. This is sort of like storyboarding for a movie. And they're really, because I'm my own artist, I can make them I'm my own writer, I'm my own artist. I don't have to, explain this to anybody else. But it's still important just to block everything and to see where things are in relation to each other. I create these thumbnails, and these are really rough, as you can see. But they help me just make sure that the narrative flows correctly, that it remains dynamic, that it leads your eye across the page, and all that sort of stuff. Here's a specific, I don't know why I chose this specific moment, but this is a moment where Leo and Michelle are deciding how much stuff to pack as they're evacuating. On one hand, they've had to evacuate before for many hurricanes, but they always passed over to the east, so it's a real pain in the butt to have to do that, and then you come back and have to unpack everything all over again. So they're deciding, should we just pack for a day or two, or really, is this going to be a bad one? And so you can see even here that after I've written the script, I still make changes to it as I'm drawing it, and I often you find that your pictures can, the old cliche that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So sometimes you find when you're drawing something, you don't need some dialogue you'd written, or you can cut it down because the picture is doing a lot of the work of explaining things. And this is a really simple layout of the two panels where they're discussing what they're going to bring. This is sort of a page that's in transition from pencils to letters and inks. So you can see it taking shape here. And then this is what it looks like actually inked. And the final colored art. Now, a lot of people have asked me, why did you color it so strangely, with this two-color series of this very limited palette of two-color sequences. And I feel like I need to actually explain that a little bit. So one of my things is, like, most people associate really bright, colorful comics with the superhero type stuff or fantasy comics. And now that people do everything digitally, you can create like just an explosion of realistic color in your average X-Men comic. But I find that super saturated color actually removes me from the experience and makes me feel like, oh, okay, now we're going into the world of superheroism. It's not real life. So my solution to that is to create a very limited color palette to really reduce the equation in the colors. And I feel like in a way that humanizes the story more and makes it actually feel more real and more closer to life, even though obviously people are not orange and yellow. But I did want to use, so I have this reduced color palette that's sort of a constant throughout all my work. But in this case, I wanted to use the color sort of as a soundtrack for the film in a way to kind of create some emotional reaction in the reader, some kind of response. So in the early stages of the book, in the early parts of the book before the hurricane, I went for this kind of golden feel, like the golden age of New Orleans, when New Orleans was New Orleans. Then as we move forward, if my slide will go, there we go. We get this gathering of the storm section, and that's sort of what people talk about, that the color of the sky gets this sort of greenish color when a hurricane is building, and it's really eerie. Then when the storm hits itself, there's aqua tones, blues and greens, the menacing floodwaters. This was another choice that I made, which was to show the water basically as this black mass that you couldn't see underneath, because there was so much fear about the floodwaters when they were laying there in the city for weeks on end. Everyone talked about how there was dysentery in the waters and all sorts of horrible diseases and snakes floating around. And, it was just this thing like, So I really wanted to create feeling of that menace. And, there are long stretches in the book where Abbas and Darnell are wading through the waters and the cars get swallowed up and everything gets swallowed up by it. It becomes a sort of character in itself. And then when the days following the storm, everybody just talked about how humid it was and just how hot and horrible. And it was the very height of summer in New Orleans, which is already, in the deep South. So again, I was trying for something that's almost irritating to look at, like these colors in combination, this yellowish green, this greenish yellow and this red. There's something angry and irritating about it. And that was the stress and trauma that Denise was going through at the convention center. Then in the book's last two sections, we jump ahead in time about a year or so, or a year and a half, to when I'm now talking as a character in the book myself. I appear just to be the sort of interlocutor, the one who's asking everybody about their experiences. And at this point, the narrative of the book changes from basically there being no narration and just us seeing the events as they unfold to now having the characters sort of talk about what's happened to them. So, and there were two reasons for this. One is just as a narrative device, it was important because I was going to be jumping ahead a lot in time, and I needed ways to do that smoothly. But also I wanted to just remind people that I am the person who made this book. This is not something that was made through committee or a machine or through an internet program or something. This was a human being, myself, with my own subjective reactions to things, my own style as a cartoonist, my own interests in what I wanted to hear about, and the creator of the book. So I switch at this point from 2 to 3 colors to give the story a little more clarity, maybe a little more of a feeling of permanence. And the final section of the book is the colors of Mardi Gras, purple, green, and gold, justice, faith, and power. The actual flag of New Orleans features 3 fleur-de-lis and the colors red, white, and blue, which just didn't seem as distinctive to me. So the Mardi Gras flag sort of felt right. And I think I actually only used the green in the very last panel there to show the actual Mardi Gras flag. So that was the book. What's interesting is sort of like where this journey has led me. In addition to getting a chance to speak at settings like this one, in 2010, I was contacted by the U.S. State Department to travel to the country of Myanmar, Burma, as an ambassador of free expression. I was chosen in part precisely because AD is critical of our government, city, state, federal, in its handling of the hurricane and the aftermath. And in that way, they felt at least that my work embodies American ideals of freedom, of expression, a key tenet of civil society. So I've actually been sent to a number of countries that don't really have a healthy civil society, where artists wouldn't be permitted to tell stories that even hint at the government not being perfect, and also would probably not use comics as a way of telling those stories. So it's an interesting opportunity that I've had to go to some of these places. I've been to Egypt before the revolution. I was in Burma, as I was talking about. Bahrain, Palestine, and Israel, some really interesting places. And when I was there, I took part in a week-long, in Burma, an international comics conference and did workshops with professional Burmese cartoonists. Then in Bahrain, I met some cartoonists there. I gave a workshop who I ended up befriending on Facebook, and then they had if you guys remember the Arab Spring, they had this tiny country, Bahrain, went through a lot of turmoil. The 2 cartoonists that I met were on opposite sides of the conflict, so I ended up doing a story about that. AD then led me to collaborating with Brooke Gladstone on her book, The Influencing Machine. And then that led to a journalism fellowship at the University of Michigan. This is like a Where's Waldo picture. There I am. So apparently, I'm now what's called a comics journalist, and I've been working in that capacity since returning from the Journalism Fellowship in 2013. And this is sort of a typical, series of conversations that I have when I tell people I'm a comics journalist. Either people are like completely confused, they are bored and fall asleep, or they think I write about comics for a newspaper or a magazine, and I have to explain sort of what I've just been talking to you about. My newest published project is called Terms of Service. It was co-produced with Al Jazeera America, the cable channel, and it's free on their website, and talks about big data and sort of how do we all navigate through this new world where our data is being collected on us constantly, not only by the government, but by private corporations and Facebook and Twitter and social media, GPS devices, heating devices in your home, the Nest thermostat, Fitbit, all that sort of stuff. We talk about all those things that are worth thinking about as you embark out into the world. So I'll wrap things up now with a little update with some of the characters. I've actually been in touch with them, as I talked about, and since it's the 10-year anniversary of the hurricane, I even did a little follow-up piece online about what these folks are up to now. I'll start with Denise. That's a recent picture of her. She's had her ups and downs. She won a grant working with small business startups in New Orleans, but then that was over. She left the city again and returned reluctantly to Baton Rouge. Her mother passed away, and she has struggled with health and housing issues. The doctor returned to his medical practice, which serves people from all economic backgrounds. He lives in the same house and pretty much took up his life as it was before. He actually threw a great party for AD when the book debuted down there, which involved the band at the end of the night jumping into his pool fully clothed. I caught up with him and most of the other characters back in August. Here he explains that the quote-unquote sliver by the river, which is his area, the French Quarter, is fine. But once you get out of the tourist areas, there are blocks that were filled with houses, and now there are maybe 1 or 2 houses per block. We still have a huge poor population. Crime remains a tremendous problem in New Orleans. Their murder rate has soared again, 2 to 3 murders a week. Leo and Michelle, they got married, they rebuilt their lives. Denise still coaches the women's team at the gymnastics club. Leo's beard has gone gray. He rebuilt his comics collection with the help of a lot of people on the internet, actually. And he now manages the comic store that he used to be a customer of, which is pretty cool. I've never entertained the idea of leaving New Orleans. The dreams I had of working in a comic book shop were always predicated on living in the city. So in the book he's called Abbas because his actual name is Hamid, but he was worried about, I don't know what exactly he was worried about. When it came to doing the book, he asked me if I would change his name from Hamid, because he just felt uncomfortable being like a public figure for some reason. He never really told me why. So we agreed to use the name of his brother who had passed away as his name in the book, and I drew a mustache on him in the book. In the original version online, he's clean shaven. Anyway, he told me like within months or weeks after the book came out, students from local universities would come to his store with copies of the book and be like, "This is you, right? Will you sign the book for us?" And he just had to realize that this anonymity wasn't working, and he was fine with it. So when it came to doing this recap, he allowed me to use his real name again. He said, "You wouldn't recognize me. I don't have a single hair in my head that's black. My hair is white, snow white." After all that time, after 16 years in the location, he had to close his store in the summer of 2012. For whatever reason it was, they didn't want to renew the lease. Okay, kiss my ass. I'm out of here. I still have some properties in New Orleans Parish. I still have that triplex that I had on Calhoun Street near the store. Every time I go there, I go the other way, from Fontainebleau, so I don't pass the store. He tried to act as if it was no big deal, but that was sort of a key thing to me. And after swearing he'd never return, Hamid's friend Mansell, in the book he's called Darnell, his real name's Mansell, ended up moving back to New Orleans from Atlanta. I love this. Hamid says, "Yeah, he moved back. You can't be from here and get out of here. Where are you going to get an experience like that? I never regretted a minute. It was a huge experience. We went through a lot. We were in there swimming, sleeping on the roof. That really was a real bond. After something like that, we stick together. It's hard to split. You know what I'm saying?" And Kwame, he was the high school kid. He graduated from college. He returned to New Orleans with Teach for America. He went back to work with his fellow New Orleanians on their devastated public school system, which is still a very controversial issue because it's now completely a charter school system. And now he's based in Massachusetts as a regional director of Teach for America. He's a married man with a wonderful daughter. Being from New Orleans is something I've always been aware of. I couldn't change it if I wanted to, and I wouldn't want to. And there's his 16-month-old daughter. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we're going to get started then. For those of you who remain for the question and answer session, thank you very much. I think I will turn it out unless, Josh, you had anything to conclude with. To anyone who would like to ask a question? To Josh? Yep.
I was just curious as to the scenes that you cut out of the book and what they were entail, or what they entail.
Oh, you're talking about the stuff I talked about with Denise. Yeah, there were scenes she mentioned of a kid who was shot in the back by a police officer as he was running away, and I was not able to find any secondary sourcing on that, so I just was a little concerned about including that. And then there was a really terrible scene. She talked about a woman who gave birth on the sidewalk outside the convention center, and the baby didn't make it, and I just was like, oh. I felt like at that point it was just too much, you know. And again, I don't know if she saw that the baby was stillborn or died or whatever. I just wasn't comfortable again with you know, as a journalist, you're taught to make sure you get secondary sources and verification, and everything else that she told me, you know, was documented, and that one, since it didn't happen directly to her, I again was hesitant about including it, and also pushing, you know, the emotional quotient over the edge. So those are the ones that I mostly remember.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent. Anyone else?
What is the Legacy Project?
John, do you want to address that? Legacy Project is a lecture series intended to bring interesting, innovative, and culturally diverse speakers to campus and expose students to them. So I think Josh is a good example of that. Question, okay.
Yeah. When Hurricane Sandy happened over here and it devastated a lot of the Jersey Shore, did you have any interest in doing anything related to that in terms of a story?
Yeah, actually, just through bad luck, I was in Michigan for a year on that journalism fellowship when Sandy hit, so I wasn't here, and it was very frustrating because I really wanted to, first of all, to do something. I live in Brooklyn, you know, there were parts of Brooklyn that were really hit hard as well, and I just wanted to bear witness, you know, to it, but I did end up later on doing a short piece about a family in Red Hook, Brooklyn, which was really badly affected by the storm, and it's sort of a parallel story to something that happens in AD with a collection of books and treasured objects. So if you Google me or something, you can find that story. But that was, yeah, it was like I didn't come back to the city until almost a year after the hurricane, so didn't get to do too much to it with it. But it did feel weirdly, I don't know, just bad luck. Of course, I felt terribly for everybody who was affected by the storm. Did any of you ever imagine that we would have a major hurricane up in this part of the country? It was, there had been, what was it, Irene the year before, but that hadn't been nearly as bad. And then, what is this, global warming or what? Someone's mad at us, clearly.
Thank you.
In your book, you reference that Denise believes the government left them behind. And how do you feel about right now with the South Carolina flooding, Governor Lindsey Graham asking for support, yet not offering and actually denying it for Hurricane Sandy for residents here in New Jersey?
I'm not familiar with what's going on in North Carolina.
Oh, South Carolina.
In South Carolina. So what you're saying during Sandy, he refused to send
Denied funds and help for Hurricane Sandy.
Oh, like as in his role as a
Governor.
okay.
Or a senator, I don't know
Yeah, well, I mean, it always is sort of like what's happening in your own backyard, right? Unfortunately, I mean, I hate to be cynical about politicians, but enough said, I guess.
I'm just curious because it's hard to believe I was 13 when that actually happened, but what you said about all the crime being rumors, not being true, like that's the first time I've ever heard that. Like this whole time I thought it was like a war zone down there. So I guess my question is, what do you think that, like, how did all that come about? Was it agenda setting theory from the media or just people spreading rumors?
Well, there were a lot of rumors which were repeated by people higher up in the food chain, like police officials, the mayor himself. They were getting verified stories. They were just repeating things that they heard lower down. And yeah, I mean, I think the editor of the Times-Picayune, made a really good point that we're hardwired to believe certain things about people of color or about lower, people of lower economic status. There's actually a really good book which talks about like case studies of major similar events where people have been thrown together in devastated communities and how almost always there are these expectations of chaos. And in almost every case, that's not what happens, that people band together, they help each other out. One of the things I talk about in the book is that there were a lot of gangbangers who were at the convention center, but they declared a truce, even though they were from rival gangs that would, in other circumstances, maybe have had a rumble or whatever, that in this case they agreed that the most important thing was, as they said, taking care of the old people and the shorties, and helping, like they kept making sure that when evacuation buses were coming, that the older people and the children would get to the front of the line, and they were sort of self-policing because there was nobody of any authority who was there. There were, and this story is true, a huge number of New Orleans police force just abandoned ship when the storm happened and the flooding happened. They just took off in their patrol cars and left. So there was basically no law enforcement until the National Guard came in, some days later. But, and there were a lot of people who were prepared for war, but very, very few instances. There was also this whole meme of showing, if they showed African American people in a store, they called that, if they were getting supplies, needed supplies for themselves in this flooded city, they would call that looting. It would always be this caption, a family looting, or, some young men looting a store. Whereas if it showed white people, they would say, desperately gathering supplies to preserve their safety during the storm. So there is like a media narrative that came into play, for sure.
Hi.
Hi.
Do you think, since you said that there is a stigma in the media about race, do you feel that it's your obligation now that you've interviewed these people and have had such an experience with them to kind of change the way media is, or let people know that media is presenting that wrong image?
Well, I always hesitate about using the term the media because I think it's a collection of lots of different medias, and everybody has the media that they think is truthful and honest, and then the media that the other people listen to, that's clouding their mind and distorting them and lying to them, and both sides feel that way. So where's the truth in there? But I feel like it was my job to be honest about where I'm coming from and what my not where my alliances are, but where my sympathies are. And other than that, stand back and let these people tell their own story about their own experiences. So I would say the only time that I really editorialized in this project was it was really important to me to get Denise's story in there because it was such a there was such a strong wall of misinformation about what actually happened at those two places, and I knew that it wasn't going to be forgotten about, that even when the corrections came out, people weren't going to remember that. And I've gone to other countries and talked about Hurricane Katrina, and people in those countries also are under the misconception that all of this violence and chaos happened at those two places. So if I could strike one little blow for truth, in this book, that would be the place where it feels the most important to me.
Okay, we only have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to say one more question here.
This is a more general question. I don't think this form of journalism, the comic journalism, is people know a lot about it. It's kind of one of those uncommon things. But I was wondering how you think it tells the story differently than say regular journalism. What does it get across to people that regular written word cannot?
I just have to say, it's a good question. I was just at New York Comic Con last weekend, and at one point, I was in the Artist Alley, which is where all the individual artists have their tables set up and they're selling original art or whatever. So I was selling my humble little comics there, and this guy came up in a costume, and he looked at me, and he looked at I have a little sign that says, "I tell nonfiction stories using journalistic techniques." So he looks at me, he's like, "Oh my God, this is so weird, dude. What is it that you do?" and I was like, "Well, I tell real stories. Like this book, I showed something about a travel story. I collect the weirdest comics, there's manga, Japanese comics out there that are about cooking and tennis and stuff. I gotta get one of your books, man. This is so weird." And I was like, "All right." So yeah, it's funny because I've lived in a world for the last 5-10 years where I've done 3 books of nonfiction. I worked with Harvey Picard, who told life of being a VA, a Veterans Hospital clerk, in Cleveland, Ohio, the most mundane details of his life. As he said in his book, ordinary life is pretty complex stuff. So on one hand, I'm in this sheltered community where nonfiction comics is just totally normal. And there's some great books out there. Marjan Satrapi's book, Persepolis. You were talking about some of the other works about Art Spiegelman with Mouse. But there is a big world out there where this is still considered totally bizarre and freakish, So all I can do is just continue to do it, to serve as a sort of missionary for this other form of storytelling and come to events like this and talk about it. And to answer your other question, I feel comics, the 2 things it can do is it can make you really feel like you are there with the characters. There's an intimacy that Scott McCloud talks about this, where you project yourself onto these characters having these experiences, and it really feels emotionally truthful to you in a way that maybe reading about it in a magazine or a newspaper wouldn't have that same feeling. And you also have the freedom, and I think the license from readers, to recreate scenes that you couldn't possibly have witnessed yourself. But if you can get enough information, you can actually make that scene happen in real time and have the reader experience it. That you couldn't do, obviously, in print or radio. You would just have to describe how it happened or have someone talk about it. But this, you can actually have, these characters go through this experience. So I think those 2 things give it a power that's unique to the form. And I always say to people, don't read AD as a definitive account of Hurricane Katrina by any means, or New Orleans, but add it to the list of other really strong material that's out there about this event. If you're interested in this event, there's Spike Lee's documentary When the Levees Broke. There's a book by Dan Baum called 9 Lives. There's great radio pieces that This American Life did. Fill out your body of knowledge and have AD be one component in that history.
Okay, thank
you again, Josh Neufeld.
Thank you.